Within the first hour of the battle at Houston during the entire invasion, the war planning had called for a very rapid strike conducted by the Trojan shock armies in concert with the landing of the 1st PLAN Marine Brigade as the PLA 83rd Group Army of the Chinese Army, or their ground forces, was emerging from their CCP regime properties and striking at their various objectives, namely key military targets, as well as also even armed reactionary civilians, which had been planned for in the war planning, as well as also the People's Armed Police in the form of their 36th PAP regular brigade, striking at their own objectives, which included also even a military element in the form of a battalion-sized unit called the 3rd Squadron of the 278th Armored Cavalry Regiment. As various armed reactionary civilians, as well as also civilian refugees, had begun to flee from the savagely brutal People's Armed Police forces who early on were already surrounding and destroying a group of armed reactionary civilians who had emerged from their homes in a outlying suburban housing neighborhood at the sound and feeling of the earth shaking from the various blasts from the enormous salvos of artillery being fired by the different artillery assets of the 83rd PLA Group Army, including its 83rd Artillery Brigade, among all the artillery battalions within each and every one of their combined arms brigades as well, not to mention the sea-based missile strikes, as well as also the air power brought to bear, which was monumental in the form of the Russian Tu-22M bomber squadron, each single aircraft able to carry 53,000 pounds of conventional ordnance, when all combined equated to 16 Hiroshima atomic weapons in terms of the conventional payload of the aircraft put together, not even counting the limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions carried by the fighter aircraft involved in the operation, as primarily they were armed with air-to-air munitions but did carry some air-to-ground weapons. But that would change over time as the fighters would be fitted out and exchange their air-to-air munitions in for air-to-ground munitions when the USAF had been completely and totally neutralized, mostly on the ground, as the tandem anti-satellite cyber strikes and booting on of electronic warfare assets had completely and totally eliminated the American ISR network, which essentially meant that they couldn't see any of what was going on, minus what they could see right in front of them till it was essentially right overhead. And by then, it would have been too late. And they could also not effectively communicate over longer distances and hence be able to organize any cohesive and coordinated or effective means of defense. All defense would be carried out at the most local of levels, and at very localized levels when it couldn't be properly coordinated and did not have proper logistical assets backing them up, it was doomed to failure from the start. And although armed reactionary civilians had been tailored into the war planning, these forces were at a severe disadvantage early on in the fighting because if the military was so bad off with their ISR networks being gone, they were far worse off and essentially would be annihilated where they stood in many cases due to the simple fact that they knew not where the enemy was, where they were coming from exactly, until the enemy could be seen with their own two eyes, and by then it was often too late, as the enemy had ISR dominance with their WZ-8 stealth high-altitude reconnaissance drones, CH-4A high-altitude armed reconnaissance drones, as well as also all of the quadcopter squad and platoon level assets at the lowest level, as the Chinese and Russian forces had an actual drone doctrine built into their military and paramilitary forces, which wasn't the case with the Americans, who, although they possessed drones, were not completely built around them. The ability to have quadcopter reconnaissance drones at the lowest level mapping out the battlefield and sending all the data back to an AI network that processed all the real-time fluid battlefield data allowed for the invasion forces to respond in a far more flexible and adequate manner than had ever been the case before, as the AI systems would literally advise them on the most efficient means by which to utilize their forces and resources and enabled them to do so in the most safe way, as in minimizing or mitigating the possibility of any types of friendly fire casualties, which allowed actually for certain maneuvers that were never before possible in warfare. As on the opposite end of the spectrum, America had now been thrust into the Stone Age. They were in the same position that the Iraqis were in the Gulf War, actually worse, as they had essentially no idea what to expect at any given moment, as well as the inability to coordinate any types of massive grand strategy at the very most local of levels. They would often be spotted first and as a result destroyed. In modern warfare, anything that can be seen can in turn be destroyed. As there were some instances where there were groupings of armed reactionary civilians that attempted to attack PLA logistical assets in the form of the 83rd Sustainment and Support Brigade of the 83rd PLA Group Army, there were bands of roughly 200 armed reactionary civilians each that had spotted movement on CCP regime properties west of the main Houston area and Katy area, where the CCP had purchased properties for these forces to be stationed on and build up logistical capabilities over time. And although the armed reactionary civilians attacked, these non-combat logistical elements were still armed with crew serve weapons. They were still trained to fight in case they had to defend themselves. And of course, they still had the full support of air power in the form of the 20 Wing Loom 2 combat drones, any of which could have been called upon to help the forces on the ground. Also, the air support in the form of close air support coming from the J-10 fighter aircraft or the Su-27 fighter aircraft of the Su-27 squadron operating in the area, or even the J-20 stealth fighter aircraft with their accompanying FH-7A stealth combat drones, which doubled their number from 12 to 24 within that squadron, as those were their equivalent of what the Loyal Wingman program was supposed to be for the Americans. As these forces were armed to the hilt, and the armored phalanxes of the different combat formations were all on the move within the first hour of the invasion. The American forces, now lacking the ability to see effectively what was happening, had to operate off of instinct and do their best to try and mitigate what was happening to them at a shocking rate of speed that they were woefully unprepared for. As all of the artillery strikes, the air strikes and air raids from the enormously powerful strategic bomber aircraft, the missile strikes from the sea and also from the air, including from the shorter range missiles fired by the combat drones, and also the missiles fired from the Strategic Missile Forces assets from the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade, which itself was a Trojan unit in eastern Texas, firing its DH-11As and DF-11As and DF-15Cs in support of the operations occurring in this particular battle space, including those fired at Ellington as well as certain other targets. The situation was essentially a very desperate one indeed, as the armed reactionary civilians, as well as also refugees fleeing the emergence of the savagely brutal People's Armed Police battalions materializing in the northwest of the core metro area, had essentially run into these American Army National Guard forces and had advised them that there were enemy forces approaching, as these forces could not figure that out on their own, as they had to depend on essentially what was either foot-based scouts, vehicle-based scouts, and in this case, fleeing civilians trying to warn them as they passed through the area on the approaching danger, as two different People's Armed Police battalions from their standard People's Armed Police Brigade, the 36th, from the 4th Corps of the 2nd Mobile Contingent, were moving through the area in a flank clearance operation to allow for another battalion finishing up and crushing quickly a grouping of just under 200 armed reactionary civilians in a suburban housing neighborhood that had emerged from their homes with weapons in hand, with their lead elements from the battalion already taking to the highway, with the others to follow soon behind them as they finish that operation up, before moving deep into the city to strike at their primary targets and objectives. The flank clearance operation was very important, as 249 ran adjacently to the location wherein the bivouac area that had been leased for use by the state and federal regimes for the 3rd Squadron was located. They were trying essentially to disperse their forces, as the lieutenant colonel in overall command over this squadron or battalion-sized unit were trying to fan their forces out in this general location, which was several miles in total length from northeast to southwest, and it encompassed a commercial/residential area in the northeast, and to the southwest, it was an upscale suburban housing development. And as these forces fanned out, cruise missile strikes had been launched by sea-based PLAN assets to strike the bivouac location, as the intel had been ascertained prior to the invasion's kickoff on where all of these locations were. Hence, that would be figured into the targeting of these areas, and cruise missile or tactical ballistic missile strikes or airstrikes or all of the above would be launched. And in other instances, some areas would be simply just overrun. As the People's Armed Police forces approached, with armed reactionary civilians ending up staying in the general vicinity to assist in putting up a fight against these forces, materializing behind them further to the southeast was yet another PLA force of support assets of the 83rd Support and Sustainment Brigade of the PLA's 83rd Group Army, as they all materialized on their CCP properties in this general area, which was known as Katy or West Houston, as these properties had been purchased and turned into large logistical hubs. Many of these forces would be moving into the West Houston airport, which included these two People's Armed Police battalions with them, as this would be captured and utilized during the colonization operations to come as one of the major FOBs located in the Houston metro area among all the other airports and airstrip sites, as these could boast large cargo aircraft which could be utilized for bringing in enormous hauls of logistics, as well as also doing troop rotations, moving forces in and out of the area as required, as these forces would eventually all move into the area to the south of the river, which ran through the Houston core metro area here. There was two different artillery battalions merged together, the 2nd of the 114th as well as the Fires Battalion from the 278th Armored Cav Regiment itself. And because they no longer had ISR assets or capabilities they would need in order to utilize their howitzers, they would need to use the old ways of artillery fire, as in they would actually have to utilize forward scouts to find targets who would then come back by vehicle or on foot and relay that data to them as it pertained to where they would fire against these forces. And they would actually end up later in the battle firing against two different support battalions, by which point one would have moved into the West Houston airport by the time that information had been carried back to these forces who did not have communications, who did instead had to rely upon scouts to get such data as it pertained to the passage of foot-based or vehicle-based scouts, as again, the communications were being jammed, ISR network was down, there was no satellite-based data transfers, there was no internet-based anything that was connected to the internet was hacked and removed as an asset. Hence, they needed to rely upon foot or vehicle-based spreading of messages, which was exceedingly difficult with all of the air, artillery, and ISR dominance of the enemy. However, they would get some messages back and would fire against these forces, many of the shells ending up landing on empty spaces by the time these forces began moving. However, this battalion would actually get hit a bit harder than even this one would, as this one would be in the process of moving by the time the artillery shells would be fired at it. As the battle was now erupting in this area, at the same time as this was going on within the first hour, the combat was in full swing as the PLA and Marines were capturing the port in Texas City, Texas, to offload the heavier assets of their brigade, of the 1st PLA and Marine Brigade. Also, as this was occurring, all of the different PLA troops were well on the move, taking their various different first objectives, which included, among other things, major interstate networks, with I-10 being the most important of all of the interstates within which this city was a junction for, as Interstate 10 would end up being the interstate traveled by the external prong of group armies 15 through 20 as they would move up upon completing the McAllen/Lower Rio battle before passing Corpus Christi en route to the Houston area, from which they would end up getting on Interstate 10 and traveling into the American Southeast, from which point they would begin to fan out to assist all the other Trojan forces already there doing the heavy lifting and conducting the combat operations in the area. As sites like this were a frequent sight around the nation, much less in this particular area, as anybody that was on the roads at these times would often get caught in the crossfire and lit up by the very heavy and potent armored phalanxes of PLA or other types of ground forces moving through the area, which also included some of the heaviest forces like tanks among the mechanized infantry, anti-tank forces, and more. As armed reactionary civilians and American troops alike would be under heavy assault, the highways would become highly contested areas where many would meet their end. The air power would also make a massive difference as well as all of the missile strikes, loitering munition strikes, and the total ISR dominance, which was ubiquitous, as in most cases, at the squad level, every single solitary squad had access to these quadcopter assets, at least in the PLA and Russian armies. But when it came to the paramilitary elements, it was typically for at least the People's Armed Police at the platoon level and up, although there were some PAP units that had them at the squad level as well. As the People's Armed Police, at least in this particular battle, were primarily, in terms of their vehicles, in terms of combat vehicles, equipped with the WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle versions that came equipped with a very powerful 25mm autocannon and 7.62 by 54mm coax machine gun, and with the armor personnel carrier version had the standard machine gun turret for a W-85 machine gun with gunner. And, of course, they had their MRAPs and other headquarters vehicles for their headquarters platoons, such as their Shangji trucks and their MV3 fuelers and armored recovery vehicles in the form of the Type 84. And the Tiger MRAPs were the MRAPs of choice frequently for these forces. As they would move through the area and clear buildings, the stack teams would move through the buildings, hunting down holdouts in said buildings, and quickly moving through tactically and liquidating enemy forces. And such would be the case in the area where the battle with the 3rd Squadron of the 278th Armored Cav Regiment would be occurring, as well as also a scattered and mixed group of armed reactionary civilians, which all were on different levels insofar as their overall capabilities and preparedness, and there was no real standardization of weapons or equipment among them. And some even had more tactical training than did others, such as Army combat veterans, for instance, or Marine Corps combat veterans, versus your standard armed reactionary civilian with zero tactical training and very little proficiency when it came to their physical fitness or being in shape or even the mental capacity to fight in such a high-intensity conflict. Going to the map of the area mentioned, where the bivouac location had essentially been rented out in a warehouse facility that was to be utilized by a major delivery firm, one that many people use. And there were some empty warehouse facilities that were located within the larger area that had been essentially leased by the state and federal level regimes for use by the 3rd Squadron of the 278th ACR, which itself was a squadron that boasted 2 tank companies, a mechanized infantry or rifle company, and also a support company and a headquarters company, with the headquarters company having already left along with the mechanized infantry company and the other tank company, with support company elements at the time of the opening of this map physically moving into the area to support the tank company by delivering some of the ammunition required for them to be able to sustain any type of operations, and would end up being utilized in a mechanized infantry style capacity, although they lacked any infantry fighting vehicles, as again they were a support unit. They had as their armored vehicles, their M113 armor personnel carriers, which would be utilized as an armored support and logistical vehicle, including also the armored ambulance versions of such. And they also had their LMTV trucks, but this was the headquarters platoon, which also had the 2 command tanks of the armored, or tank company rather, and the 3 different tank platoons were now, had left their bivouac site, had moved up the street, and one had gone into this shopping center at the first sign of trouble, as essentially what had occurred was, as the People's Armed Police Company that is spotted right here had basically been moving down these different city blocks, clearing all the buildings in the area, the vehicles had been firing down the streets at fleeing civilian vehicles, as the People's Armed Police was given orders to fire on anything that moved. As, again, while the PLA tended to bend the Geneva Conventions, the PAP outright broke them and had no regard for the enemy civilian population whatsoever at all, as their commanders seen it as essentially aiding in eliminating problems further down the road, as they decided that eliminating the civilian population prevented those civilians from becoming part of any uprisings later down the road. It was a morbid and twisted logic, but in a very horrifying way made some sense. As they were firing at fleeing vehicles, the American military forces, having moved on the street in the form of the Army Guardsmen in their different tank platoons, had gone into this shopping center with big box stores that was directly across the street from this massive warehouse complex. And there was an apartment complex just to the southeast of this shopping center, whereby the headquarters platoon had gone in between 2 apartment buildings. The support and logistical troops of the support company had disembarked in squad formations from their platoon of M113 armored logistical vehicles that were bringing in supplies for the tank company deployed in this particular area. As this battle occurred over a battlefield that was actually several miles in total length, it spanned from the 249 highway area all the way to the south and west into a large, relatively upscale suburban housing neighborhood, which was located a kilometer away to the southwest, as there were the streets that gradually connected to it from the bivouac location. As the lieutenant colonel of the squadron had made the decision to do everything in his ability to try to preserve his combat strength, he had dispersed his forces over a relatively larger area to try and get them out of the centralized bivouac location, as for all of them to be in the same area would present a tempting target indeed for missile strikes, as even at the very opening, cruise missiles were already airborne and heading for the bivouac location that those forces had fled from and began dispersing out of. And 2 YJ-18B submarine-launched cruise missiles were about to impact this site and completely annihilate it, as the Type 039s, which were fully capable of launching these missiles, had fired a salvo of such at various targets throughout the entire metro area, as although Ellington was perhaps the biggest target of the attackers firing their different munitions at, the more localized and spread out dispersed targets of the 278th Armored Cav Regiment and their 4 accompanying other battalions from other parts of the 36th ID, primarily coming from the 256th Infantry Brigade Combat Team and the 155th Armored Brigade Combat Team, each contributing 2 battalions to assist the 278th Armored Cav in their mission, were all being targeted by these different missile and air strikes from the naval-based missile assets, the land-based missile assets, such as the 616th Strategic Missile Forces Brigade from the Eastern Theater Command of China, as well as also the air power, which was immense and was already laying waste to massive parts of the city. As this area here was primarily different city blocks with small businesses, including a gas station and many different types of small stores, auto repair shops, and barber shops. Everything was in this particular area. These were big box stores, and this was an apartment complex. Across the tributary here that lay between this area and the highway, the State Highway 249 here, which the People's Armed Police Battalion that had just finished up crushing a grouping of armed reactionary civilians to the immediate northwest, had its leading companies already on the highway and racing fast into the downtown area of Houston, as they had far more pressing objectives after they had conducted their flank clearance operation, which was occurring in this particular area before they got on the highway to race into the city proper. As the elimination of the American 3rd Squadron of the 278th Armored Cav Regiment was a pressing issue, a flank clearance issue of its own, as this force with their tanks presented a threat to any forces moving down the interstate. PLAAF air power had been called in to drop their limited numbers of air-to-ground munitions, as they were primarily armed at this time at least with air-to-air munitions. They still each carried 4 laser-guided air-to-ground 1,000-pound munitions. And these over here were just flying their standard combat air patrol, ensuring air superiority, while this company here was moving down and beginning to fire at the headquarters elements, as there were 2 Max Pro MRAPs with 50 cals here. One of the headquarters squads had gone around this apartment building to be able to observe what was going on, and the loitering munitions that had been fired all throughout the area, of which there were 7 of them moving into this area, were fired from a volley of 48 fired from the TEL-like truck-based system that was operated by the headquarters battalion over the 36 PAP Brigade, firing 48 to support their other flank clearance operation against armed reactionary civilians in a whole different separate neighborhood to the general north of this fighting, with the rest moving into this area, which included this particular specific area, as well as also the area of the fighting that was going on to the immediate south and slightly west, which included the large suburban housing development within which these American forces had found themselves, as they had fanned out to hurriedly remove themselves, essentially to quickly extricate themselves from the nearby, approximately only 1 kilometer away, location where they had been bivouacked, which was now being hit by missile strikes from the sea-based assets, these being 2 cruise missiles, YJ-18Bs, flying through this particular area. As by now, the 2 Wing Loong 2 combat drones in this specific area were giving close air support of their own to the People's Armed Police troops moving in on the ground. As in this specific instance, there were 2 full battalions of People's Armed Police attacking the 3rd Squadron. And although these were a relatively light brigade of these paramilitary elements, they still possessed tank-killing capabilities in the form of the man-portable HJ-08 anti-tank missile systems, and would deploy hunter-killer teams into this particular area as their different platoons had dismounted from this company right here, with the headquarters platoon a bit off the map, moving through the area as they tactically went building to building, these different rolling T formations moving across the street, as these were 2-floor buildings, as they were watching the upper floor and the first floor. They were clearing these buildings at the opening of the map as the vehicles were moving up alongside of them, using their combat data links and radio communications to be able to coordinate their actions. As this squad right here, moving up in a line formation, proceeded outside the building as per standard operating procedure with these forces here as they watched the outside of this city block, along with the vehicles here, and the vehicles moving up here were doing the same for their forces on this block, as well as also in this block, as this squad was moving up on this block to watch the block, pausing in this area here because there were enemy forces here. And at the very opening of the map, this parking lot had been turned into a miniature kill box of sorts, as the Headquarters Battalion over the 36 PAP Brigade encapsulated its fire support company, which was essentially a mortar company of 82 millimeter mortars, and they were firing these mortars into this area, which could not destroy, of course, an Abrams tank or really do much of anything to it, but these mortars were being fired more in the sense of trying to eliminate any bailing crew members that would try to flee from these tanks, as they were about to be destroyed by these Wing Loong 2 drones firing these CM502KGs and HJ-10 anti-tank missile systems at these tanks, which both types of missiles were very powerful and relatively longer range, as the CM502KG in particular was a dual-purpose anti-ship and anti-armor missile, and the HJ-10 was a relatively longer range anti-tank missile with double what the tow missile system was, actually over double what it was, at a 6.2 mile range for the HJ-10, and it was a relatively large and powerful anti-tank missile. And these were slamming into the tanks of this tank platoon at the opening of this map, completely annihilating them before they even had so much of an opportunity to fire on these vehicles. And although these vehicles would take some fire from the support forces moving up the street here, they were laying down enormous volumes of fire on their own with their very powerful 25 millimeter autocannons on their infantry fighting vehicle versions, firing their HE armor-piercing ammunition, as well as also the 7.62 by 54 millimeter coax machine gun firing to boot. And the heavy machine gunners firing their W85s were letting loose as well, as the 12.7 millimeter machine gun was a very powerful anti-material weapon in and of itself. As this company was moving up the access road that ran adjacent to the highway itself, their last combat platoon of the 3 that comprised the company, along with the headquarters platoon trailing behind, the 3rd platoon had disembarked their 5 squads to basically move through the area on the other side of 249 to clear it, as they already had their ISR assets Scouting the area for activity, they've found very little on this side, but they found some in the form of armed reactionary civilians upon which a mortar strike had been ISR directed on this house, destroying it as some had been spotted going in this house. An 82mm mortar landed on the house and completely annihilated it. And there were some outside of the house behind it that were wiped out at the very opening of the map. This house was badly gutted, as indicated by the red on this side, and the side of this house was badly gutted as well, indicated by the red on it. And the personnel, the armed reactionary civilians in the backyard here, were KIA'd, as well as those that were inside of it. While these 5 squads of troops from the 3rd platoon here in the line were moving under the highway overpass. They were moving through this gas station on the other side of this fencing that separated the backyards of these homes on this street from the small businesses and this small shopping plaza and these 2 restaurants that were on this street. With this line formation squad torching this restaurant, causing these armed reactionary civilians to flee out the back, as this place was now ablaze, as the Type 74 flamethrower-wielding People's Armed Police troops were torching it, similar to the torching of this house, as there would be plenty of torched buildings to come, as this was a terrifying incendiary weapon to be on the receiving end of. The small arms wielding troops, as well as also firing their Type 69 anti-personnel rounds from their rocket-propelled grenade systems, and also their 35mm tube-fired grenades from beneath some of the rifles of the men that possessed those, and the light machine gun fire just shredded these armed reactionary civilians up, who didn't even have a chance to return fire, as they were hurriedly fleeing out of this building that was being torched and also fired upon by this squad in the line formation, as this wedge formation moved around this side of this restaurant before breaking into 2 halves, with 5 men becoming a stack team and going into this building from the back door, clearing it before coming back out, and the other half of their squad watching along the fence line while they cleared the building before reforming and taking the corner of the building to maintain watch as a wedge formation over this area, while the other wedge formation moving through the area would essentially do similar on the other side of this street and watch their flanks on this side of that street, while the 3 other squads moved through this area here and torched a few more homes. And as these armed reactionary civilians were fleeing the area under fire, they were not only taking fire as these forces had cleared this home while this squad moved alongside of it, while this other squad cleared this home and then came out the front, before then bounding to the end of the street here and laying down fire, as well as the Type 74 flamethrower operator torching this house, as they had earlier torched this house while they waited in between these 2 homes, causing these forces to flee. A mortar strike had been ISR directed, finishing these personnel off, as indicated by the green arrow encapsulated in red. They'd all been annihilated, KIA'd. As all of that was going on at the same time, these actions were also occurring with the clearance of these buildings and the movement to clear these other buildings, as these squads had proceeded to hurriedly rifle their way through these buildings, while this squad in a wedge formation moved up here and held their position by the street and the bridge that crossed this tributary right here in this wooded area. Before then, as they waited for their forces to clear these areas and the vehicles to move up, then across the street while their vehicles paused, while the other squad that had moved up to assist, staying and watching this city block, had bounded into this area and gone in between these 2 massive buildings, these 2 massive big box stores, and would become a hunter-killer team with their HJ-08 wielding anti-tank missile troops who carried them, there were 2 in the squad that carried those, set up their systems, as by that point, these tanks had long since been destroyed, but there would be reinforcements moving into the area coming from one platoon of the support troops who, although a bit late arriving, decided to press their attack. But by then it would be far too late, as by this point these loitering munitions had already since moved into the area and hit these tanks. Also, they hit these other headquarters vehicles, these loitering munitions, in conjunction with this company in a straight line with their weapons staggered, moving in and laying down heavy fire between these apartment buildings and already wiping these forces out, as well as the squad of the headquarters platoon troops that peeled around this building, checking the area, using their binoculars to try to see what was going on and then relay that information back to the rest of their forces. Hence the reason why they were moving around the whole area, because there was confusion and panic due to there being no ISR capabilities. And as they had come around the corner, they had been wiped out by 25 millimeter fire, also 12.7 millimeter fire from the 12.7 millimeter machine gunners, and also the loitering munition strikes from the heat warhead-laden CH-901As that had not only been fired into this area, but also others to support the combat occurring here, as well as to the immediate south in a kilometer stretch where the headquarters company was, and also beyond in the area where there was a more upscale housing neighborhood that was being attacked by other companies of the 2 different PAP platoons operating in this one specific area, that were also supported by very powerful air support from PLAAF fighters coming in and dropping their 4 1,000 pounders, which were laser guided. They also had the Baidu guided types, which were satellite guided from the Chinese military satellites. And they would drop these in support of their ground forces, as these were relatively light forces that, although they had their tank busting capability in the form of the man-portable systems, their vehicles would be at risk from the American tank-based fires if the American tanks were so able to spot them and fire before they themselves were to be destroyed in turn by the Wing Lung 2s, the J-10s, and the hunter-killer teams of troops who disembarked from their IFVs and APCs to utilize these weapons, as was being done here, as over here, these 2 platoons of tanks had been hit by the J-10 strikes, dropping their 1,000-pound laser-guided munitions, destroying these tanks, as the cruise missile strikes annihilated this. But by that time, this platoon of support troops had since moved into this area and fanned out, along with the dismounted squads at the opening, having lost troops here due to the mortar strike that hit right here from these 2 squads. And as they peeled around, there was the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th squads of this platoon that had already disembarked. And as they peeled around, they were being fired at from within these buildings as the People's Armed Police troops went in and cleared these buildings in their stack team formations, going from room to room, hall to hall, methodically and tactically clearing the buildings. The troops set up in these buildings and then were firing out of the buildings with their flamethrowers, their Type 69 rocket-propelled grenades, their HJ-08 anti-tank missiles, their hand grenades, barrel-fired grenades, small arms fire, light machine gun fire from their QJB 201s, and also their Type 67 general-purpose machine guns. There were a few troops that carried those as well. And they were all the while supported by heavy fire from their WZ-551 infantry fighting vehicle and armor personnel carrier versions of these vehicles, firing into these armor personnel carriers and shredding them up with 25 millimeter fire. And the 12.7 millimeter machine gun fire also did a number on M113s. And although they fired back with 50 cal ammunition, which caused a little bit of damage to these lead vehicles. It didn't do much to them, and the return fire was enormously destructive, as the difference between the armor on the WZ-551s and those on the M113s was night and day. This was more of an aluminum alloy armor that would actually catch fire under certain circumstances, and this was RHA, very powerful steel armor. And although the 50 wouldn't have penetrated, the M1 Abrams tank and its 120 millimeter tank shells damn well would have penetrated and annihilated those vehicles, hence the reason why the ISR assets spotted them first, and airstrikes were immediately called in to nullify the armor threat, along with the Wing-Loon 2s called in to do the same, before these forces moved up to within optical range of the optics on the tanks, which had the tanks come around and looked straight up the street and fired right away, instead of these forces giving them time to get here before they opened fire at fleeing armed civilians. Had that happened, they might have gotten one or two of these platoons' vehicles, but the airstrike that was called in was extremely sudden and devastating. And as the loitering munitions came in, they finished off the headquarters elements, especially the command tanks, the two command tanks in the headquarters platoon of the leadership, the company commander and the first sergeant and the XO. They were wiped out with the loitering munitions, and the fire coming from the WZ-551s fired between these apartments and annihilated these MRAPs, as well as the M88 armored recovery vehicle, the LMTVs, the fueler. All that was destroyed. And the cruise missile strikes were devastating, but these vehicles had been out of range by the time they got here. They were already over here, and they were safely on the other side of the building. And the flamethrower attack annihilated these two squads coming from these troops, this squad moving alongside these buildings, with a squad clearing this squad going in and clearing this one, setting up in here, with this squad clearing this building, having moved and set up here, and this rolling T clearing this building, this rolling T formation from this squad, clearing and setting up in this building, having fired at these forces in conjunction with this squad, using their flamethrower on these forces, with the squad that went into this building torching these troops, as well as also firing their Type 69 anti-armor rounds and also anti-personnel rounds, as well as the 35 millimeter grenades, hand grenades, and their small arms and general purpose light machine guns at all of these forces, including the vehicles, along with the vehicle-based fires, shredding up these armored vehicles as well, these M113 APCs, which were utilized as essentially armored supply vehicles to supply frontline combat troops in battle. And over here, as they got into the kill box, the mortar fire had resumed as these squads had dismounted from the vehicles, and these squads were instantly KIA'd, along with the fire coming from these hunter-killer teams between these two buildings. As again, this squad, upon having checked the corner and cleared the area, bounded over here and stopped and waited for their vehicles to move up to provide them any type of support they would need, along with this wedge formation bounding into this wooded area and pausing temporarily, waiting for them to stop before them bounding over here, and then moving up here and pausing, waiting for this action to be carried out by this whole company moving up here. And although they took return fire, the fire they meted out in return was beyond crushing. And as they peeled around the corner and took position here, there was a brief exchange of fire with these hunter-killer teams, wiping out these vehicles and firing at these dismounted troops, who did fire back, and they did manage to KIA a small handful of PAP troops between these two squads. They had gotten 5 PAP troops between both squads. This squad took 3 KIAs, this one took 2. But the return fire meted out was devastating, and along with the mortar strikes resuming, had completely wiped out this platoon of support troops that had moved into the area and originally at first intending to support and supply these armored forces with badly needed ammunition, as they had departed with a limited number of rounds, as their departure was done hurriedly, as the lieutenant colonel in command had been well aware of the fact that all of the pounding from the air and artillery strikes would very nearly get his forces if he didn't hurriedly disperse them and get them the hell out of the area quickly. And he was absolutely right about that, because the cruise missile strikes coming in had annihilated the warehouse facilities that they had been utilizing as their temporary bivouac site before they would be then moved to protect their assigned areas, which in the case of the 3rd Squadron most likely would have been the West Houston Airport, as well as also a handful of water treatment facilities located in the city. There were also power plants that, due to the suddenness of the invasion, just simply could not be protected, such as the energy power plant here, and there was an additional power plant in the southeast of the downtown area near the river as well. The forces that were under attack here were just one grouping of the forces being attacked, as again, the actual headquarters company itself was off the map in a 1 kilometer area that separated this particular portion of the battle from this portion of the battle, which will be gone over in the next video of this series, as this hypothetical series highlighting 4th generation warfare doctrines during the 4th generation warfare invasion of America will continue in the next videos with the Houston battle installment. The fighting here essentially was between 2 companies from the 3rd Squadron, its other armored company, its other tank company rather, and its mechanized infantry company, with the headquarters company in the kilometer space that separated this map from this map to the direct north and slightly east, as the rest of the forces had fled that way to the south and slightly west, and ended up in this area and essentially were, for all intents and purposes, trying to conduct a fighting retreat once it was realized and understood, as so many civilian refugees were fleeing the areas, that PAP forces were approaching and were now preparing to fight them and conduct a fighting retreat in search of other friendly forces which they could run into and try to put up a better resistance and make a better stand, as on their own, this was only a few companies worth of troops, and they had now, by this point, been cut off from the rest of their squadron, as they had lost contact with their commander within the headquarters company, which again lay in the area that was between this map and this map, which was a kilometer between this map of the city and this map here, which was the housing development that these 2 other companies ended up in, conducting their fighting retreat. And in the other area separating both maps, between the 2 maps, the kilometer stretch of land where the headquarters company was, it too was under attack by other subordinate comprising companies of the 2 different People's Armed Police battalions that were attacking the area. More to come in the next video.